The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, stamped with the official seal of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, and I knew before opening it that my peaceful life in Bakersfield, California, was about to become significantly more complicated. My name is Henry Yates, and I had been living in my modest two-story house on Maple Grove Drive for exactly 3 months when the HOA decided to make me their latest target. The letter was printed on expensive cardstock, the kind that screamed, "We have money and we are not afraid to use it against you." And it informed me in no uncertain terms that my storage shed was in violation of community standards and needed to be removed within 30 days, or I would face daily fines of $250. I stood in my driveway, reading the letter twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The storage shed in question sat at the back corner of my property, a weathered but sturdy structure about 12 feet by 8 feet, painted a faded green that had clearly seen better days. When I bought the house from the estate of the previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Brennan who had passed away at 92, the shed had been there, along with everything else. The home inspection had noted it, the appraisal had included it, and not once during the entire purchasing process had anyone mentioned that it might be a problem. I walked around to my backyard, studying the shed with new eyes. It was not falling apart, though it certainly was not winning any beauty contests. The roof was solid, the door hung straight on its hinges, and inside I had already stored my lawnmower, gardening tools, and various boxes of things I had not yet found places for in the house. The whole situation felt absurd. The next morning, I called the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered on the second ring with a voice that could have cut glass. "Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Patricia speaking. Hi, my name is Henry Yates. I received a letter yesterday about my storage shed, and I think there has been some kind of mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Yates. Your shed violates Section 12, subsection 4 of our community guidelines, which clearly states that all external structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Board prior to construction and must meet specific aesthetic standards." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that getting angry would not help. "I understand that, but I did not build the shed. It was here when I bought the house. It has been here for as long as anyone can remember." "That is irrelevant, Mr. Yates. The structure is in violation, and as the current property owner, you are responsible for bringing your property into compliance. Can I speak to someone about getting it approved retroactively? It is a functional shed. It is not an eyesore, and I really need it for storage. The Architectural Review Board meets once a month. The next meeting is in 3 weeks. However, I should inform you that similar requests have been denied in the past. The board prefers uniform appearances, and your shed does not match the approved designs." "What approved designs? Can I see those?" Patricia sighed, as if I was being deliberately obtuse. "They are available in the Community Guidelines packet, which was provided to you at closing. Now, if there is nothing else, I have other calls to attend to." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and feeling the first stirrings of real frustration. I had bought this house with my savings after working as an electrical engineer for 15 years, scraping together every penny for a down payment, and now some faceless HOA board was telling me I had to tear down a perfectly good shed that had been here longer than most of the neighborhood. I spent the rest of the day digging through the boxes of paperwork from my home purchase. The Community Guidelines packet was 147 pages of dense, single-spaced text covering everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the exact shade of beige allowed for house paint. Section 12, subsection 4 was indeed very clear. All external structures required prior approval. But there was nothing about grandfather clauses, nothing about existing structures, nothing that would help me. That evening, I drove to the house of my neighbor Margaret Chen, who had lived in Riverside Meadows for over 20 years. She was in her garden when I arrived, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and pulling weeds from around her roses. "Henry, good to see you. How are you settling in?" "I have been better, honestly. The HOA is demanding I tear down my storage shed." Margaret straightened up, brushing dirt from her knees. "The green one in your backyard? That thing has been there forever. Walter used to keep all his woodworking tools in it." "That is what I thought. Do you remember when it was built?" She frowned, thinking, "It was there when I moved in, and that was 2004. I remember because Walter helped my husband install our fence that first summer, and he brought tools from that shed. But I think it was already old then. Have you talked to Dorothy Franklin?" She lives 3 streets over, been here since the neighborhood was first developed. I got Dorothy's address and thanked Margaret, feeling the first glimmer of hope. If I could prove the shed had been there long enough, maybe there was a legal argument for keeping it. Dorothy Franklin turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who invited me in for coffee and seemed delighted to have someone to talk to. Her house was filled with photographs, many of them showing the neighborhood at various stages of development. "The shed," she said, settling into her armchair with a photo album balanced on her lap. "Yes, I remember when Walter built that. It was 1987, maybe early 1988. The neighborhood was still being built then. Most of these houses went up between 1985 and 1990. Are you sure about the date?" "Quite sure. My daughter was pregnant with her first child, and I remember watching Walter work on that shed while I was knitting baby blankets on my porch. My grandson was born in October 1987, and the shed was finished by then. Walter was very proud of it. He built the whole thing himself, even poured the concrete foundation." I felt my heart rate pick up. "Do you have any photographs?" She flipped through the album, pointing to various images. "Here, this is from a neighborhood barbecue in the summer of 1988. If you look carefully in the background, you can see Walter's shed." I leaned in, squinting at the old photograph. Sure enough, there in the corner of the image, slightly out of focus but definitely identifiable, was my shed, already painted its distinctive green. "Would you be willing to write a statement about this? The HOA is threatening daily fines if I do not remove it." Dorothy's expression darkened. "That HOA has been a thorn in everyone's side for years. It was not always like this, you know. Used to be reasonable, just basic maintenance standards. But then Patricia Sutherland took over as president 5 years ago, and it has been a nightmare ever since. Last year she made the Johnsons repaint their entire house because the trim was half a shade off the approved color. Cost them $8,000. Patricia Sutherland? I think I spoke to her on the phone. That does not surprise me. She runs that office like it is her personal kingdom. I would be happy to write a statement. That shed is part of this neighborhood's history, and Walter was a good man. He would not want his work torn down for no good reason." I left Dorothy's house with a written and signed statement, a photocopy of the photograph, and a burning determination to fight this. That night, I started researching property law, HOA regulations, and grandfather clauses. What I found was encouraging. Structures that predated HOA rules or zoning regulations were often protected under grandfather provisions, especially if they could be proven to have existed before the regulations took effect. The next step was finding out when the Riverside Meadows HOA had been established and when their rules about storage sheds had been implemented. I spent my lunch breaks for the next week at the Kern County Recorder's office, digging through property records and HOA filings. The neighborhood had been developed starting in 1985, but the HOA had not been formally established until 1992. The first set of architectural guidelines, including the prohibition on unapproved storage structures, had been adopted in 1993. My shed had been built 6 years before those rules existed. Armed with this information, I prepared a formal response to the HOA's violation notice. I included Dorothy's statement, the photograph, the property records showing the shed's existence on tax assessments dating back to 1988, and a detailed legal argument about grandfather provisions under California Civil Code. I sent it certified mail and waited. The response came 2 weeks later, and it was not what I hoped for. Patricia Sutherland herself had signed the letter, which stated that the board had reviewed my materials and found them insufficient. The letter claimed that even if the shed predated the HOA rules, I had purchased the property knowing the current regulations and was therefore obligated to bring it into compliance. The 30-day deadline remained in effect, and I now had less than a week to remove the shed or face fines. I was reading this letter for the 3rd time, my blood pressure rising with each word, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I did not recognize. "Mr. Yates? This is Robert Finch. I am an attorney here in Bakersfield. Dorothy Franklin is my mother-in-law, and she told me about your situation with the HOA. Oh yes. Thank you for calling. I have dealt with Riverside Meadows HOA before, unfortunately. Patricia Sutherland and her board have been overstepping their authority for years. Most people do not fight back because the legal costs seem too high, but your case is actually quite strong. Would you be interested in meeting to discuss representation?" We met the next day at his office downtown. Robert Finch was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a calm, confident demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He reviewed all my documentation, asked detailed questions about the property purchase and the HOA's communications, and then leaned back in his chair. "This is going to be expensive, I will not lie to you about that. But I think we can win, and more importantly, I think we can set a precedent that will help a lot of other homeowners in your neighborhood who have been bullied by this HOA. The shed clearly predates the HOA rules, which means it is grandfathered under California law. The HOA cannot force you to remove a legal, pre-existing structure just because it does not meet current guidelines." "How expensive are we talking?" "For a case like this, probably between $15,000 and $25,000 if it goes all the way through litigation. However, I would be willing to work out a payment plan, and if we win, we can request that the HOA pay your legal fees as part of the judgment." I did the math in my head. It was a lot of money I did not really have after buying the house. But the alternative was tearing down a useful shed and letting the HOA think they could push me around. And Dorothy's words kept echoing in my mind. Walter would not want his work torn down for no good reason. "Let us do it," I said. Robert drafted a formal legal response to the HOA, citing specific sections of California Civil Code 4725 and 4040, which dealt with architectural standards and enforcement. He demanded that the violation notice be withdrawn and that the HOA acknowledge the shed's grandfathered status. He sent it with a clear message. If they did not back down, we were prepared to file suit. The deadline passed. True to their word, the HOA began assessing daily fines of $250, adding them to my monthly HOA dues statement. I did not pay them. Robert had advised me to keep careful records of everything but not to admit fault by paying. 2 weeks after the deadline, we received the HOA's response. They were not backing down, and they considered the matter closed. The fines would continue to accrue, and if I did not pay, they would place a lien on my property. "That is actually good news," Robert said when I called him in a panic about the lien threat. "It means they are committed to their position, which makes our case stronger when we go to court. We are going to file suit this week." The lawsuit was filed in Kern County Superior Court. Henry Yates versus Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. We were suing for declaratory relief, asking the court to officially recognize the shed's grandfathered status and for an injunction preventing the HOA from assessing any further fines or taking any action against the shed. We also requested attorney's fees and costs. The HOA hired a large law firm from Los Angeles to represent them, which told me they were taking this seriously. That both worried and emboldened me. If they were spending that kind of money, it meant they saw this as a threat to their authority, which meant we might actually have a chance to change things. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was exhausting. The HOA's attorneys demanded every piece of documentation related to my property purchase, my finances, my communications with the HOA, and more. Robert and his associate, a sharp young attorney named Grace Wu, worked tirelessly to respond to everything while submitting our own discovery requests. We wanted every document related to the HOA's establishment, their architectural guidelines, and their enforcement history. What we found in those documents was revealing. The HOA had been very selective in their enforcement. Several other properties had structures that predated the HOA rules, but those owners had never been targeted. There were sheds, decks, gazebos, and even a greenhouse that had been built in the late 1980s and early 1990s, all still standing, none of them approved under current guidelines. "This is gold," Grace said during one of our meetings, spreading printouts across the conference table. "They are engaging in selective enforcement, which is prohibited under California law, and HOA has to apply their rules uniformly. They cannot target you while ignoring violations on other properties. Why do you think they are targeting me specifically?" I asked. Robert and Grace exchanged a look. "Honestly," Robert said, "you are new. You do not have relationships in the community. You are an easy target. Patricia Sutherland has built her reputation on being tough, and she probably thought you would just comply rather than fight. She miscalculated." As we dug deeper, we found something even more interesting. The property records showed that Walter Brennan had actually obtained a building permit from Kern County for the shed in 1987. It was right there in the county files. A permit issued on March 15, 1987 for a 12 by 8-foot storage structure, with a final inspection marked as passed on June 3, 1987. The shed was not just grandfathered under HOA rules, it was a fully legal permitted structure that had been built to code. "This changes everything," Robert said when I brought him the permit documentation. "Now we are not just arguing about HOA rules. We are talking about a legally permitted county structure. The HOA has zero authority to demand its removal." We filed an amended complaint adding the permit information and strengthening our request for attorney's fees. The HOA's response was to file a motion to dismiss, arguing that the courts should not interfere with HOA governance and that I had agreed to abide by HOA rules when I purchased the property. The hearing on their motion to dismiss was held on a Wednesday morning in late September. I took the day off work and met Robert at the courthouse, my stomach churning with nerves. This was my first time seeing Patricia Sutherland in person, and she did not disappoint. She was exactly what I had imagined, a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, an expensive navy suit, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. She sat behind her attorneys, radiating confidence. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Judge Ellen Kowalski, listened patiently as both sides made their arguments. The HOA's lead attorney, a slick-talking man named David Richardson, argued that the court should respect the HOA's authority to govern their community and that property owners had an obligation to follow the rules they agreed to when purchasing their homes. Robert's response was measured and precise. "Your Honor, this is not about HOA governance. This is about an HOA exceeding its legal authority by attempting to force the removal of a legally permitted structure that predates their own rules." The shed in question was built with a county permit in 1987, 6 years before the HOA even adopted architectural guidelines. Under California law, such structures are protected. Additionally, the HOA has engaged in selective enforcement, targeting Mr. Yates while ignoring identical structures on other properties. This is arbitrary and capricious action that violates Mr. Yates's rights as a property owner. Judge Kowalski asked pointed questions of both attorneys, then took the matter under submission. "I will issue a written ruling within 2 weeks," she said. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. I threw myself into work, trying not to obsessively check my email every 5 minutes for news from Robert. The fines were continuing to accrue, now totaling over $15,000, a number that made me nauseous every time I looked at my HOA statement. The ruling came on a Friday afternoon. Robert called me at work, and I could hear the smile in his voice before he said a word. "We won." Judge Kowalski denied their motion to dismiss. She said your complaint states valid claims and that the case will proceed to trial. But even better, she included language in her ruling that strongly suggests she thinks you are going to win on the merits. She specifically noted the building permit and the selective enforcement issue. I sat down at my desk, suddenly lightheaded with relief. What happens now? Now they have a choice. They can continue to fight this, spend a lot of money on attorneys, and probably lose at trial, or they can settle. My guess is they will want to settle, especially after this ruling. But we will see. Robert's guess was correct. 10 days later, David Richardson called him to discuss settlement terms. The HOA wanted to resolve the matter without a trial, but Patricia Sutherland was insisting on conditions. They wanted me to paint the shed to match approved colors, install proper gutters, and keep the area around it landscaped to HOA standards. "Absolutely not," I told Robert when he relayed these terms. "They do not get to demand anything. They were wrong. The judge basically said so, and they need to back off completely." Robert negotiated back and forth for 3 weeks. The HOA gradually backed down on their demands, but Patricia kept trying to insert little provisions that would give them some face-saving appearance of authority. Finally, Robert had enough. "We are going to trial," he told David Richardson. "Judge Kowalski has already indicated she thinks our case is strong. Your client can spend another $50,000 on legal fees and lose, or they can accept reality now. Your choice." The final settlement offer came 2 days later. The HOA would acknowledge the shed's grandfathered status in writing, withdraw all fines and violations, and pay $75,000 toward my attorney's fees. In exchange, I would agree to basic maintenance of the shed, keeping it in good repair, and not allowing it to become a genuine eyesore. The agreement would be filed with the court, making it a binding court order. "Take it," Robert advised. "You get everything you wanted. Plus, they are paying for most of your legal costs, and the court filing means this becomes precedent that can help other homeowners." I signed the settlement agreement in Robert's office on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 7 months after I had received that first violation notice. Patricia Sutherland was not present. Her attorney signed on her behalf. The whole thing felt anticlimactic after all the stress and fighting. But the story was not over yet. About a week after the settlement was finalized, I received a call from a reporter at the Bakersfield, California newspaper. Someone had tipped her off about the lawsuit and settlement, and she wanted to do a story about HOA overreach. I agreed to an interview, figuring it might help other people who were dealing with similar issues. The article ran on a Sunday, front page of the local section. It detailed the whole saga, included quotes from me and Robert, and featured the photograph from Dorothy's album showing the shed in 1988. The headline read, "Local Homeowner Defeats HOA in Battle Over Historic Shed." The response was immediate and overwhelming. I received emails and phone calls from dozens of people in Riverside Meadows and other HOA communities around Bakersfield. They told me their own horror stories: fines for parking their cars wrong, demands to remove children's play equipment, forced landscaping changes that cost thousands of dollars. Many of them mentioned Patricia Sutherland by name, describing her as vindictive and power-hungry. One call in particular caught my attention. The woman identified herself as Brenda Wallace and said she lived 2 streets over from me. "Mr. Yates, I am so glad you fought them. I need to tell you something that I think you should know. Last year, my husband and I wanted to add a small deck to our backyard. We submitted plans to the Architectural Review Board, and they denied it. Patricia Sutherland told us it did not meet standards. But then, 2 months later, I saw that Patricia's friend Susan Marshall was building an almost identical deck. I asked about it, and Patricia told me Susan's design was different. But it was not different. I have photographs. They are exactly the same design. That is interesting, but my case is already settled. I am not sure what I can do with that information." There is more. I started keeping track after that. Over the past 2 years, Patricia has approved building projects for her friends while denying identical projects for other homeowners. And the fines? She only assesses them against people she does not like. Her friend Karen's house has had peeling paint for over a year, which is a clear violation, but Patricia has never sent her a notice. Meanwhile, she fined the Martinez family $5,000 because their fence was 4 inches too tall. Have you documented all of this? Yes, I have a spreadsheet with dates, photographs, everything. I was planning to bring it up at the annual HOA meeting, but I was afraid Patricia would retaliate by targeting my property next. Can you send me that information? I am not sure what we can do with it, but my attorney should see it. Brenda emailed me her documentation that evening. It was damning. She had meticulously recorded over 30 instances of selective enforcement, comparing approved projects against denied projects, noting relationships between board members and property owners, and documenting who got fined versus who got warnings or was ignored entirely. The pattern was clear. Patricia Sutherland was running the HOA as her personal fiefdom, rewarding friends and punishing people she disliked. I forwarded everything to Robert, along with a note. "Is this something we should report to someone?" He called me the next morning. "This is bigger than I thought. Selective enforcement is one thing, but this level of favoritism and discrimination could potentially be fraud, especially if she is assessing fines as a personal vendetta. HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of all homeowners. I am going to make some calls." Those calls led to an investigation by the California Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs in the state. Robert also contacted a few other attorneys in town who had dealt with Riverside Meadows HOA issues, and they started comparing notes. The picture that emerged was even worse than we had thought. Patricia Sutherland had been diverting HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, disguising them as community maintenance costs. She had awarded contracts for landscaping and repairs to her brother's company without competitive bidding, at rates significantly higher than market value. She had used her position to harass homeowners who questioned her authority, including one family who had been forced to sell their home and move because the constant fines and violations became unbearable. In January, about 3 months after my settlement, the Department of Real Estate filed formal charges against Patricia Sutherland and 2 other board members who had participated in the financial misconduct. The charges included breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and misappropriation of funds. The HOA was placed under state supervision, and a special election was called to replace the entire board. I attended the special meeting where the investigation findings were presented to the community. The room was packed with angry homeowners, many of whom I had spoken to after the newspaper article. Patricia was there, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, trying to maintain her composure as the state investigator detailed the findings. The financial misconduct alone totaled over $200,000 over a 5-year period. The investigator presented bank records showing how Patricia had approved payments to her brother's company for work that was never done or was billed at triple the normal rate. There were credit card statements showing HOA funds used for her personal shopping trips, restaurant meals, and even a vacation to Hawaii that she had claimed was for a conference on HOA management that did not exist. When the investigator finished, the homeowners were invited to speak. One after another, people stood up to share their experiences with Patricia's reign of terror. Mrs. Martinez talked about the fence fines that had nearly bankrupted her family. A man named Tom Bradford described how Patricia had forced him to repaint his house 3 times because she kept claiming the color was wrong, even though he was using the exact shade from the approved list. Dorothy Franklin stood up and talked about Walter Brennan, about how he had built his shed with his own hands, and how Patricia had tried to erase that history. When it was over, the vote to remove Patricia and her allied board members was unanimous. Criminal charges were referred to the Kern County District Attorney's Office. The criminal case moved slowly, as these things do. Patricia hired an expensive criminal defense attorney and tried to fight the charges, claiming everything was a misunderstanding and that any financial irregularities were due to poor bookkeeping rather than intentional fraud. But the evidence was too strong. Bank records do not lie, and the pattern of self-dealing was impossible to deny. In June, almost a year after my initial violation notice about the shed, Patricia Sutherland entered a plea agreement. She pleaded no contest to multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. As part of the agreement, she was required to pay full restitution to the HOA, perform 500 hours of community service, and serve 18 months in county jail. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in California. I attended the sentencing hearing with Dorothy, Margaret, and several other neighbors who had been affected by Patricia's actions. The judge was not sympathetic. "Miss Sutherland, you were entrusted with the responsibility of managing a community and protecting the interests of your neighbors. Instead, you abused that trust for personal gain and used your position to bully and harass people who had done nothing wrong. The harm you caused extends beyond the money you stole. You made people's homes, their sanctuaries, into sources of stress and fear. That is unconscionable." Patricia showed no emotion as she was led away. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her go to jail, only relief that it was finally over. The new HOA board, elected in a special election in March, immediately set about fixing the damage Patricia had caused. They reviewed all outstanding violations and fines, dismissing those that appeared to be retaliatory or based on selective enforcement. They refunded money to homeowners who had been forced to pay for unnecessary modifications. They revised the architectural guidelines to be more reasonable and flexible, including a proper grandfather provision for existing structures that predated the rules. Most importantly, they issued a formal apology to everyone who had been mistreated under the previous board's leadership. It was a small gesture, but it meant something to people who had felt powerless and victimized. As for my shed, I did end up making some improvements, not because anyone forced me to, but because I wanted to honor Walter Brennan's work. I repainted it a nice deep green, installed new gutters, and built a small garden bed around the perimeter. I filled the garden with the same roses that Dorothy said Walter used to grow. Every time I look at it now, I think about Walter building it with his own hands back in 1987, taking pride in his work, never imagining that decades later it would become the center of a legal battle. The shed became something of a neighborhood landmark after the newspaper coverage. People would walk by and point it out, telling the story to visitors and new residents. It represented something larger than itself, proof that you could fight back against unfair authority, that documentation and persistence mattered, that one person standing up could make a difference for an entire community. Dorothy and I became close friends through the whole ordeal. She started teaching me about gardening, sharing cuttings from her plants, and showing me how to properly prune roses. She told me more stories about Walter and the early days of the neighborhood, when people actually knew their neighbors and helped each other without needing formal rules to govern every interaction. "You know what Walter would say about all this?" she told me one afternoon as we sat on her porch drinking iced tea. "He would say that the shed was just a shed, but standing up for what's right is what builds real community. He believed in taking care of things, doing work properly, and treating people with respect." Patricia forgot all of that. She thought rules and power were the same thing. The financial restitution that Patricia had to pay helped the HOA rebuild its reserves and funded several genuine community improvements. Repaving the common area parking lots, updating the playground equipment, and planting new trees throughout the neighborhood. The new board actually asked for homeowner input on how to spend the money, which was a revolutionary concept after years of Patricia's autocratic leadership. Robert Finch became something of a local celebrity for taking on the HOA case. He received dozens of new clients from people dealing with similar issues in other neighborhoods. He started giving seminars at the public library about homeowner rights and HOA law, always using my shed case as an example of why documentation matters and why people should not be afraid to stand up for themselves. The total cost of my legal battle ended up being about $18,000 after the HOA's settlement payment, which hurt but felt worth it. I set up a payment plan with Robert and paid it off over 2 years. More valuable than the money was what I learned about the importance of knowing your rights, keeping good records, and finding people who would support you when fighting against institutional power. I still live in that house on Maple Grove Drive in Riverside Meadows. The neighborhood is a different place now, more relaxed and friendly. The new HOA board focuses on actual community maintenance and safety rather than enforcing petty aesthetic rules. They organized a neighborhood barbecue last summer, and more people showed up than had attended HOA meetings in the previous 5 years combined. People talked about what they liked about living there, what they wanted to see improved, and shared stories about their families and lives. It felt like a real community for the first time. My shed sits in the backyard, weathered but solid, still doing exactly what Walter Brennan built it to do almost 40 years ago. I keep my tools there, along with lawn equipment, paint cans, and boxes of holiday decorations. On one wall, I hung a framed copy of the 1987 building permit and the newspaper article about the case. Sometimes, when I am working in the yard, I go inside just to look at those documents and remind myself of what happened. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, never assume that authority figures are acting legally or fairly just because they have official titles. Second, documentation is everything. The building permit, Dorothy's photographs, the property records those documents made my case. Without them, I would have had nothing but my word against the HOA's rules. Third, there are usually more people affected by a problem than you realize, and speaking up can give others the courage to come forward too. But perhaps the most important lesson was about community itself. The HOA was supposed to serve the community, to make it better and protect property values. Under Patricia's leadership, it did the opposite, turning neighbors against each other and making people afraid in their own homes. Real community is not about enforcing uniform appearances or wielding power over others. It is about people helping each other, respecting differences, and working together for common goals. The shed case also changed how I thought about property ownership and rights. When you buy a house, you are not just purchasing a structure and a plot of land. You are buying into a set of legal rights and responsibilities that are surprisingly complex. HOAs add another layer to that complexity, and too many people do not understand what they are agreeing to when they sign those documents at closing. I have become an advocate for HOA reform in California, testifying at the state legislature when bills related to HOA governance come up for consideration. I have shared my story with reporters, spoken at community meetings, and helped other homeowners who are facing similar battles. The legal precedent from my case has been cited in at least 7 other lawsuits across California, helping people protect their property rights against overreaching HOAs. The shed itself has held up remarkably well. I had a contractor inspect it last year, curious about what kind of shape it was really in after 38 years. He was impressed with Walter's work. The foundation was solid, the framing was true, and the roof still had years of life left in it. They built things to last back then, the contractor said. You do not see craftsmanship like this much anymore. I thought about that comment a lot. Walter had built something meant to last, to be useful, to serve its purpose year after year. He had done it right, obtained the proper permit, followed the building codes, and created something of value. And then decades later, someone who did not understand or care about that history tried to destroy it for arbitrary reasons. That pattern repeats itself over and over in different contexts. People in power making decisions without understanding or valuing what came before, without considering the human impact of their actions. The current HOA board invited me to join them last year. I declined. I had spent enough time dealing with HOA politics, and I wanted to focus on just living my life and enjoying my home. But I did agree to serve on an advisory committee that reviews architectural requests, making sure that the process is fair and reasonable. It meets once a quarter, and mostly we just talk through whether requests are genuinely problematic or just different from what board members personally prefer. Having someone who actually fought the HOA at the table seems to keep discussions grounded in reality. Dorothy passed away last fall at the age of 83. Her daughter asked me to speak at the funeral, and I talked about how Dorothy's photographs and testimony had saved my shed. But more importantly, how her willingness to stand up and tell the truth had helped expose Patricia's corruption and restore the neighborhood to what it should be. A lot of people from Riverside Meadows attended, paying respects to someone who had been part of the community for so long and who had made a difference when it mattered. At Dorothy's request, some of her ashes were scattered in the garden beds around my shed, near the roses that used to grow in Walter's yard. It felt right. She and Walter had built this neighborhood in its early days, and now they were both part of the ground that made it what it was. I am 47 now, still working as an electrical engineer, still living in the same house. The mortgage will be paid off in another 23 years if I stick with the payment plan, though I am trying to pay extra when I can. The shed is not going anywhere. It will probably outlast me if I take care of it properly, which I intend to do. Sometimes I have visitors who want to see the famous shed, people who read about the case online or heard about it from friends. I always show them around, let them see the building permit and the newspaper article, and tell them the story of how one storage shed became the center of a fight about property rights, community governance, and standing up to bullies. Most people find it inspiring, but some seem to think I made too big a deal out of a simple shed. To those people, I always say the same thing. It was never really about the shed. It was about whether I was going to let someone with a little bit of power push me around for no good reason, whether I was going to accept injustice just because fighting back was hard and expensive and scary. It was about setting a precedent so the next person would not have to fight as hard. It was about respecting the work that Walter Brennan did with his hands almost 4 decades ago, building something solid and useful that deserved to remain standing. The shed is still green, still 12 feet by 8 feet, still sitting in the back corner of my property exactly where Walter put it in 1987. It holds my tools and equipment. It keeps things dry and organized. It does what a shed is supposed to do, but it also represents something more now. Proof that having the facts on your side matters, that grandfather clauses exist for good reasons, that documentation can defeat arbitrary authority. People sometimes ask if I would do it all again, knowing how much it cost and how stressful it was. The answer is yes, without hesitation. Not just because I won, though that certainly helps, but because the alternative would have been teaching myself that it was okay to be pushed around, okay to let someone destroy something valuable for no reason, okay to remain silent when I knew I was right. Those lessons would have cost me far more than $18,000 and a year of legal battles. The neighborhood has continued to improve under the new board. Property values have actually increased since Patricia left, which is ironic considering she always claimed her strict enforcement was necessary to protect home values. Turns out, people value living in a community where they do not have to worry about arbitrary fines and vindictive board members more than they value perfectly uniform mailboxes and approved paint colors. Last month, a young couple bought the house 2 doors down from me, their first home purchase. I introduced myself and welcomed them to the neighborhood. They mentioned they had been nervous about the HOA after bad experiences elsewhere, but they had heard this one was reasonable. I told them about the shed, about Patricia, about how the community had come together to fix things when they went wrong. They seemed relieved. "So if we want to plant some different flowers in our front yard, that is okay?" the woman asked. "As long as you are not planning to turn your yard into a junkyard, you will be fine," I told her. The board cares about genuine maintenance issues, not about micromanaging everyone's choices, and if they ever do overstep, there are people here who will stand up and push back. I gave them Robert's card, just in case, and told them to call me if they ever had questions about anything. That is how communities are supposed to work. People helping each other, sharing information, standing together when necessary. The shed stands as a quiet monument to all of that. Most days, I do not think about the legal battle or Patricia or any of it. I just open the door, grab whatever tool I need, and get to work on whatever project I am tackling that weekend. The shed is just a shed again, serving its purpose, doing its job. But the story lives on, passed from neighbor to neighbor, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things are worth fighting for, and that standing up to bullies is always worth the cost. Walter Brennan built that shed with his own hands in 1987, following the rules, doing things right. 36 years later, when someone tried to tear it down, I proved it was grandfathered under every rule and protected by law. The shed is still there, and it will be there for decades more, a testament to good craftsmanship and the importance of standing your ground when you know you are right.